ripped off Somalians, ripped off that state for billions of dollars, billions, every year.
Before sunrise, federal tactical teams moved simultaneously across several American states, executing the final phase of an operation that had been quietly prepared for years. Apartment buildings, garages, and office spaces that had appeared entirely ordinary the night before were already under control. There were no sirens, no visible urgency, and no public signals. The absence of noise was intentional. It ensured that targets were reached before communication could occur and before the surrounding communities were aware that anything had changed. Financial behavior reflected the same philosophy. Transactions were structured to appear unremarkable. Amounts stayed within ranges that avoided automatic review. Businesses generated just enough visible activity to justify their existence without attracting interest. On paper, everything appeared compliant. Only when examined collectively over time did inconsistencies emerge. This long-term invisibility created a dangerous illusion. Communities assumed safety because there were no visible threats. Law enforcement faced limited pressure to intervene because there were no immediate victims or public disturbances. The system benefited from this gap between perception and reality. Its success depended on remaining beneath the threshold of concern. Such operations challenge traditional enforcement models. Without violence or public harm detection relies on sustained analysis rather than reactive policing. Investigators must look for patterns instead of incidents, relationships instead of events. In this case, the work required years of observation before a coherent picture formed. This raises a critical consideration. If a network can operate for years without drawing attention simply by appearing ordinary, how many others remain undetected? The absence of visible crime does not necessarily indicate the absence of organized criminal activity. It may indicate a more advanced form of concealment. By the time authorities moved, they were not responding to chaos. They were dismantling a structure that had been carefully built to survive scrutiny. The quiet nature of the operation was not a weakness. It was its primary defense. And it was precisely that silence that allowed it to persist until the moment it was finally exposed. As the investigation deepened, attention shifted from locations to movement. What mattered was not where the network operated, but how its resources traveled without interruption. Drugs, money, and weapons followed separate paths deliberately disconnected to prevent exposure. No single individual controlled the entire flow. Each component functioned within strict limits, ensuring that failure at one point would not collapse the system. Narcotics were handled with particular care. Quantities were divided, stored briefly, and moved frequently. Nothing remained in one place long enough to invite suspicion. Packaging was designed to resemble legitimate goods, and storage sites were chosen for their ordinariness rather than security. The goal was not concealment through force, but concealment through familiarity. A location that appeared unremarkable was less likely to be questioned. Money followed a different logic. Cash was dispersed across multiple sites, rarely consolidated and constantly in motion. Financial activity was structured to avoid attention rather than maximize profit. Transactions stayed within ranges that blended into normal commercial behavior. Shell businesses served as intermediaries, creating paperwork that suggested legitimate operations while quietly absorbing illegal revenue. On the surface, everything appeared compliant. Beneath it, the system remained intact. Identity fraud played a critical role in sustaining this structure. Personal information was used to open accounts, sign leases, and register vehicles, creating layers of separation between individuals and their activities. This reduced risk at every stage. When scrutiny occurred, it encountered names and records that led nowhere. The absence of clear links slowed enforcement and bought time. In a system built on patience, time was its most valuable asset. Weapons were present but rarely visible. Firearms were stored discreetly, not as tools of intimidation, but as insurance. Their existence suggested preparation rather than aggression. The network avoided public conflict, yet remained capable of responding if threatened. This balance allowed it to operate without drawing attention, while maintaining control internally. Weapons were present but rarely visible. Firearms were stored discreetly, not as tools of intimidation, but as insurance. Their existence suggested preparation rather than aggression. The network avoided public conflict, yet remained capable of responding if threatened. This balance allowed it to operate without drawing attention, while maintaining control internally. What made the structure especially resilient was its compartmentalization. Couriers understood routes, not destinations. Financial handlers managed accounts, not supply. Storage operators maintained locations without knowledge of timing. Information moved vertically, not laterally. This design limited exposure and reduced the impact of individual arrests. Even as enforcement pressure increased, the system continued to function. By the time the first doors were entered, the outcome was largely set. Dozens of individuals were already being taken into federal custody, removed from locations that blended seamlessly into everyday life only hours earlier. Cash, narcotics, and weapons would be secured before the morning fully unfolded. To anyone outside the operation, it looked like a normal start to the day. That normalcy was precisely what had allowed the network to exist for so long. This level of organization did not emerge by chance. It reflected learning over time. Adjustments were made in response to minor disruptions, audits, or unexpected scrutiny. Routes changed. Methods evolved. The network adapted quietly, absorbing pressure without reacting visibly. Each correction strengthened its ability to survive. Such sophistication complicates enforcement. Traditional indicators of criminal activity were largely absent. There were no sudden spikes, no visible violence, no public complaints. Instead, investigators faced a system that functioned more like an enterprise than a gang. Its success depended on discipline, restraint, and invisibility. This raises an unsettling question. When criminal operations adopt the appearance of legitimate systems, at what point do they become indistinguishable from the environment around them? The danger lies not in what is seen, but in what remains deliberately unnoticed. In this case, that invisibility sustained the network until careful analysis finally brought its structure into view. As evidence accumulated, one pattern became impossible to ignore: the deliberate absence of violence. This was not a coincidence or a sign of weakness. It was a calculated decision that shaped every layer of the operation. By avoiding open conflict, the network reduced visibility, delayed intervention, and extended its lifespan. In environments where violence often accelerates, law enforcement response restraint became a strategic advantage. Investigators noted that disputes were handled internally and quietly. There were no street confrontations, no public displays of dominance, and no actions designed to provoke fear beyond the network itself. This approach kept attention low and allowed the system to operate beneath the threshold that typically triggers urgent enforcement. Communities remained unaware, and routine patrols encountered nothing that demanded immediate escalation. The absence of violence also altered perception. Without visible harm, the operation did not register as a priority compared to more overt threats. Resources were directed elsewhere. This gap created space for the network to stabilize and refine its methods. Over time, that stability translated into predictability, and predictability reduced risk. The system did not need to move fast, it needed to endure. This restraint extended to how members conducted themselves. There were no extravagant displays of wealth, no behavior that contradicted ordinary routines. Individuals maintained consistent patterns that blended into daily life. Apartments looked lived and schedules appeared normal, and interactions with neighbors remained unremarkable. Nothing invited questions. The network relied on the assumption that danger announces itself. When it did not, attention drifted away. Weapons, though present, were treated as safeguards rather than instruments of control. Their role was defensive, not performative. This balance allowed the operation to maintain internal discipline without generating external pressure. It also reduced the risk of unpredictable escalation, which could have exposed the structure prematurely. By keeping force in reserve, the network preserved flexibility. From an enforcement perspective, this posed a challenge. Traditional models often depend on visible harm to justify intervention. In the absence of violence, investigators were required to build cases slowly, relying on data patterns and long-term observation. This demanded patience and coordination across agencies. Quick action would have produced limited results. Sustained analysis was the only viable path. The strategy of silence proved effective for years. It allowed the operation to mature, expand cautiously, and adapt without drawing attention. Each avoided confrontation reduced exposure. Each quiet resolution reinforced the system's resilience. The longer it functioned undetected, the more normalized its presence became within its surroundings. This dynamic raises a critical concern. When criminal organizations abandon violence in favor of discipline and concealment, they become harder to identify and more difficult to dismantle. Their impact may be less visible, but not less significant. Harm occurs quietly dispersed across time and space, often recognized only in retrospect. This was not a rapid response to a single incident. It was the conclusion of a long investigation that advanced deliberately, guided by patterns rather than events. Early indicators were subtle enough to be dismissed in isolation. Financial activity did not match reported income. Businesses were legally registered but showed little real operation. Communication appeared sporadic, often occurring at times when oversight was minimal. None of these elements alone suggested urgency. Together they revealed a structure designed to remain unseen. By the time authorities moved, they were confronting not a reactive threat, but a stabilized structure. The lack of violence had not reduced danger, it had concealed it. What appeared calm on the surface masked a system capable of sustained harm without drawing attention. This case demonstrates that silence, when used deliberately, can be as powerful as intimidation. The decision to avoid violence was not an ethical choice, it was an operational one, and it forced investigators to reconsider how modern criminal threats present themselves not through chaos, but through control. When the first wave of arrests was secured, the focus shifted immediately from people to proof. What investigators needed most was not confirmation of wrongdoing, but an explanation of how the system actually functioned. The answer was not found in a single discovery, but in the accumulation of records, devices, and physical materials recovered across multiple locations. Together, they transformed a coordinated raid into one of the most extensive criminal cases the state had faced in years. The initial findings revealed a level of organization that exceeded expectations. Ledgers documented transactions with precision, listing dates, amounts, and coded references that suggested established routines rather than improvised activity. These records showed consistency. Income appeared steady, expenses predictable, and movement carefully planned. This was not a network reacting to opportunity. It was a system operating on schedule. Maps added another dimension. Routes connected cities across state lines, marking transfer points and timing windows. Locations were chosen for efficiency and discretion, avoiding high-traffic areas during peak hours. Goods moved frequently, but briefly reducing exposure at any single site. The constant motion was intentional. It minimized loss and complicated tracking. Each adjustment reflected learning and adaptation over time. Digital evidence reinforced this picture. Devices contained encrypted data, fragmented communication logs, and operational notes that revealed compartmentalization. Information flowed narrowly, limiting knowledge at each level. No individual appeared to hold a complete view of the operation. This separation reduced risk and slowed investigations. Even when material was recovered, connecting it required extensive analysis. Weapons and narcotics confirmed the scale of the threat, but they did not explain control. That control was evident in the paperwork. Financial documents traced the movement of funds through shell entities designed to absorb scrutiny. Transactions were structured to appear ordinary. Compliance was simulated through documentation rather than behavior. On paper, the operation resembled a collection of small, unremarkable businesses. In reality, it functioned as a unified system. This evidence altered the trajectory of the case. What began as a series of coordinated arrests expanded into a comprehensive examination of structure. Prosecutors were no longer focused on individual acts alone. They were now tasked with presenting a model of organized activity that spanned years and jurisdictions. The volume of material required careful coordination across agencies and courts. Communities began to grasp the scope of what had existed nearby. Familiar buildings were re-evaluated, routine interactions took on new meaning. The realization that an extensive operation had functioned quietly for years challenged assumptions about safety and visibility. Concern replaced surprise as residents considered what had gone unnoticed. From a legal standpoint, the case demanded resources and patience. Thousands of pages of records required verification. Digital data needed decoding. Timelines had to be reconstructed. Each piece added clarity, but also complexity. The process was slow by necessity. Accuracy mattered more than speed. This phase marked a turning point. The operation was no longer defined by its execution, but by its implications. Evidence revealed intent, planning, and endurance. It demonstrated that modern criminal systems can achieve scale without spectacle. The true impact of the raid would be measured not by the arrests themselves, but by the clarity gained about how such networks embed, adapt, and persist until carefully exposed. As the case moved beyond arrests and evidence review, its broader significance became impossible to ignore. What authorities confronted was not merely a successful enforcement action, but a demonstration of how modern organized crime has evolved. This network did not depend on fear visibility or rapid expansion. It depended on patience, routine, and an understanding of how to exist within the boundaries of normal life without crossing thresholds that trigger immediate response. Investigators came to understand that they were not observing a violent or impulsive group. They were tracking a system built around discipline and restraint. There were no public displays of power, no open conflict, and no behavior intended to attract attention. Silence was not incidental. It was the method. By avoiding disruption, the network reduced pressure and extended its lifespan within ordinary neighborhoods. The investigation forced a reassessment of long-held assumptions. Crime was no longer announcing itself through chaos or public harm. Instead, it was embedded in systems that looked compliant, quiet, and unremarkable. The absence of disruption became its shield. By the time intervention occurred, the structure had already stabilized and adapted to its environment. That adaptability, rather than scale alone, defined its danger. Federal agencies viewed the outcome as a warning rather than a conclusion. If one network could operate undetected for years by avoiding attention, others could be doing the same. The methods exposed in this case provided a blueprint: compartmentalization, restraint, financial camouflage, and controlled growth. None of these required extraordinary resources. They required discipline. That realization shifted the focus from individual actors to patterns of behavior that may surface elsewhere. From a policy perspective, the case highlighted gaps in detection. Systems designed to respond to visible harm are less effective against threats that prioritize concealment. Addressing this requires sustained analysis, interagency cooperation, and the willingness to invest time before results are visible. Quick victories offer reassurance. Long investigations offer protection. This operation demonstrated the value of the latter. The future trajectory of such cases remains uncertain. As enforcement adapts, criminal systems will likely adjust in response. Techniques will change, routes will shift, digital tools will evolve. The question is not whether these networks will attempt to reform, but whether detection will keep pace with adaptation. History suggests that pressure alters behavior, not intent. For communities, the implications are more personal. Safety is often measured by what is seen and heard. This case challenges that measure. The absence of visible crime does not guarantee the absence of organized harm. Awareness rather than fear becomes the appropriate response. Understanding how threats can exist quietly is the first step toward addressing them effectively. As legal proceedings continue, accountability will move from investigation to judgment. Courts will assess responsibility based on evidence rather than assumption. Outcomes will establish precedent and send signals about the consequences of operating in the shadows. Those signals matter. They influence behavior far beyond a single case. This story ultimately raises a question that extends beyond one network or one operation. How many systems rely on silence rather than force? And how should they be identified before their impact becomes widespread? The answer will shape future enforcement strategies and public understanding alike. Thank you for following this analysis. If this case prompts reflection about how crime and security are changing, consider sharing your perspective. Thoughtful discussion helps clarify risks that are often overlooked. Continued attention rather than momentary reaction is what ensures that quiet threats do not remain invisible. This strategy complicated enforcement. Without visible violence or immediate harm, intervention required patience. Time became the primary investigative tool. Only through sustained observation did the full scale of the operation become clear. When action was finally authorized, it was executed in a narrow window chosen to limit exposure and prevent coordination among targets. The significance of that morning would not be measured by the arrests alone. Its importance lay in what followed as evidence began to expose how modern criminal systems no longer rely on intimidation or chaos, but on routine structure and the ability to disappear into normal life without drawing attention. What investigators uncovered did not resemble the structure of a conventional criminal group. There were no visible hierarchies displayed through force, no symbols, and no public markers of control. Instead, the system functioned by embedding itself into the routines of ordinary life. Its strength came not from intimidation, but from its ability to remain unnoticed. For years, it existed inside neighborhoods where nothing appeared out of place. The network relied on familiarity as camouflage. Apartments looked lived and offices appeared functional, and businesses were properly registered. To neighbors and passersby, these locations blended seamlessly into their surroundings. Nothing about them invited scrutiny. That was the point. By adopting the appearance of normal economic activity, the system avoided the signals that typically draw law enforcement attention. This approach required discipline. Operations were structured to minimize exposure at every level. Individuals were assigned limited roles, often unaware of the broader system in which they operated. Communication patterns were controlled and irregular, designed to avoid detection rather than maximize efficiency. Activity was spread across locations so that no single site revealed the full scope of the operation. If one component failed, the system could continue functioning without disruption. Investigators later recognized that patience was the defining characteristic of the network. It did not expand rapidly or seek dominance through confrontation. Growth was incremental, measured, and deliberately restrained. By avoiding sudden increases in activity, it reduced the likelihood of triggering audits, inspections, or complaints. The absence of urgency became a protective layer.